Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to wait just a few minutes to let others join us, and then we will begin today's conversation. All right, thank you everyone for joining us this wonderful Thursday for a great conversation. We're ready to begin today's webinar, Closing Skills Gaps Through Online Learning, the third webinar in our Emerging Priorities in Education webinar series. Just a friendly reminder that everyone is muted due to the size of audience, so we ask you please use the Q&A feature to submit questions to our panelists today. They are definitely eager to hear from the audience. My name is Cheryl Crone, Deputy Director of K-12 at the Hunt Institute, and on behalf of our organization, I welcome you to this important conversation and thank you for tuning into the webinar today for an important discussion on closing digital skills gaps. There is no question that we've all experienced a shift to virtual environments in both schools and workplaces. Within a few weeks last year, we were forced to become technology experts for our children and workplaces. However, there continues to be gaps in digital skills among students and between what is being taught in schools and what's needed in the workforce. Supporting our students as they adapt to increasingly digital world should be a priority for education leaders, whether it's closing the digital divide, providing a safe online environment, or in the case of today's discussion, leveraging technological advancements for our changing economy. Conversations around digital learning are a big part of our COVID constituency work at the Hunt Institute because they will not go away after the pandemic is over. The digital economy will continue to evolve, and we must be prepared to meet it head on. We must give our students the necessary knowledge and skills to excel in the careers of the future. I would also like to take a moment to thank our partner in our COVID constituency work, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We are appreciative of their support in this webinar series, as well as the many other resources we have produced and will continue to produce through 2021. If you haven't had an opportunity to read the beautifully illustrated report we published with Governor Bob Wise on the COVID constituency, please take a look. We'll link to it in the chat and post it on our social media during this webinar. The COVID constituency is a growing coalition of parents, teachers, students, education leaders, and organizations that I believe will create major change in our education system, which includes ensuring digital skills are taught so youth and adults are workforce ready. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Melody Schopp, Director of Education Industry Consulting at the SAS Institute, who will be moderating the discussion. Melody, thank you for joining us today and facilitating this work.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for this opportunity. I'm just really thrilled to be here today and know that the panelists who are with today are definitely some of the best that are going to be able to answer some of these hard questions. You know, I'm fascinated with this conversation for so many reasons. You know, COVID, as you said, it ripped down the curtain where we're seeing all these gaps in access and technology, but it's not a new conversation. So I'm going to take you back. I was a computer teacher in the mid-90s, and I was fascinated with that whole possibility of connecting kids beyond the classroom and beyond playing just Oregon Trail, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. That fascination then took me to the South Dakota Department of Education in 2000, and I was a technology integrationist. So we're in the early 2000s. And it was interesting because I just dug up a paper we presented to the legislature at that time. And we discussed all the policy implications on the current demographic patterns of the internet. So I'm talking 2000, access and usage. And secondly, how it potentially impacted preparing society for, and I'm going to quote, ensuring access to the internet for the next generation to prepare students for success. But that was 2000. And here we are again today. We're still talking about this same issue and the same story. So I'm just thrilled that we have these distinguished people and panelists who are going to help us to dig into some of those solutions in this new digital economy that we're looking at today. So first, I'd like to turn this to Rebecca Dovey with Code VA. Rebecca, I know that you partner with schools, parents, communities to bring equitable computer science education to all of Virginia's students. So why is providing computer science education to all students a priority, and what do schools, parents, communities, and policymakers need to understand about the necessity of incorporating these skills into the curriculum and learning?
Thank you. It's nice to see everybody. So as you mentioned, we are centered here in Virginia. We're a statewide nonprofit with the mission of bringing computer science to all students across our Commonwealth. And my work is particularly engaged in that that K-12 space. And like you, I was a computer teacher in the mid-90s. I was teaching math and computer science back then. And it's funny, again, how much things have changed and how much things haven't. So a lot of times when we're talking with schools, we actually start with talking about the myth of the digital native. If everybody remembers that book a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of assumption that students sort of in this generation automatically understood technology, automatically had all this sort of knowledge that those of us kind of on the other side of the fence didn't have. And it was really bothersome at the time, because we knew, for those of us really engaged in education, we knew that access was a real issue. I taught in a school that was rural. Literally my first year, we had a cow in the middle of the track. His name was Hoss. He did not serve our track team well because he tended to moo and scare the city kids. But what that meant is a third of our students didn't have internet access. And when I left the classroom in 2014, they still didn't have internet access. And I still have a lot of friends up there. The ratio's roughly the same, right? There hasn't been a huge shift. And so when we're making all of these sort of decisions about equity, instruction, and things like that, assuming that students have just this inherent ability because they are these digital natives, I think we're starting at basically a deficit, because we're not even acknowledging sort of what the lack of access means. For us, our work is centered specifically on computer science education. Obviously, that starts with access to technology, right? Like, you're not going to learn to code in Java or any other language on just paper and pen. At the K-5 level, we do a lot of unplugged work, but there is a transition point to where students do need to learn how to code. So when we're working with schools, we define computer science as the study of how humans engage with and solve problems using computer technology. So the kinds of problems we're engaging with and solving are universal and historic. They cross geography, generations, cultures. You know, the problems that we're solving right now, if you think about the Great Wall of China, it was about protecting people. And they had towers where they would light fires and signal invading armies were coming. That same thread and need to protect ourselves and communicate over distance for protection is the backbone of the technology we're all using right now to talk to each other. And so these are problems humans have engaged in from the dawn of human history, but we now do that through the lens of computer science. And so again, for us, there's a lot of talk about pipeline and jobs and all of those kinds of things. All of that very much is important, but I think it's important to start even a step back when we're talking with policymakers and educators. Because if we're saying that this is one of the major tools that we currently use to engage with and solve problems, the decisions we make that either invite students in or bar them from access and instruction have fundamental decisions on which communities have the power to even bring their problems to the table in order to engage with these kinds of solutions and deep problem solving that we need to do. And if you think about, historically, computer science has been a field of mostly white and Asian males. If you look at any app market on your Android or Apple phone and sort of look through the general apps that are there, that's a reflection of that. And that means that those populations that aren't in that group historically haven't had their problems necessarily listened to or engaged with in that way. And, you know, I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Shoup, that COVID really pulled the lid off of this. And I think for a lot of people made stuff that we all deeply knew were problems much, much more visible as we roll. And, you know, the one thing with technology is we know it speeds up as we go, like just the rate of innovation is not ever slowing down, which means this gap is widening very quickly. So I think those are sort of the starting points for us in terms of how we talk about this with folks and really think about the why of why it's so vital that we really start to tackle these underlying sort of system-wide issues.
Sounds like we have a lot in common, Rebecca, in the work that we did early on. It's just funny because, again, a really rural area, same sort of thing. And yet we really thought we were cutting edge at that point in time. But yet, we're cutting edge, but still talking about this 20 some years later, and we're still in the, as you say.
I was going to say, I have been offered chickens for grades. So, there is a sort of like black market sometimes it happens, but absolutely. I think, we look at sort of what we were doing then that was so innovative and the gaps in terms of where, like, okay, that was, and I think it comes down to too, also who we expect to sort of be the change makers in the space. A lot of times it comes down to one teacher in a space that's passionate and brings it to the table, which is great. But as soon as that one teacher can't spend that energy anymore, or is removed from that situation, right? So I think that's some of why we're still sort of in this cycle.
You're right.
Yeah.
So Shane, let's move to you. I know that you're at the Urban Institute, which I'd love to know a little bit more about that as well. And we know there's often equity gaps in the pathways to digital and tech industries relating to race and ethnicity, gender, and even age, actually. So from your exacerbated equity gaps, what can we do about this, Shane? Can you talk to us a little bit about that with the work that you're doing right now?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. And for those of you who don't know Urban, we've been around for about 50 years and we do research on social policy issues of various kinds. And what we say is we try to elevate the debate in social policy. I focus specifically on workforce development, post-secondary education, and we have a growing body of work that's focused on the intersection of technology and education and training. And so I'm going to talk about some of our research in that area. I was really interested in Rebecca's comments because and then the comments about the sort of myth around the digital native. Our research shows that among young people aged 16 to 24, about a quarter lack any digital skills, so that they have none, and probably it's because they don't have access to technology, right? You need the equipment to be able to practice and learn. But I think that, and even for those who have access and have some digital skills, they might not be very advanced. And then we know there are just huge issues of equity. Huge gaps for Black young people, for Latinx young people, of course, those living in rural areas. And so just a real need, given what the labor market is demanding, a real need to focus on how to develop those and support those digital skills. And I will say, even though we can talk about, your question was about computer science and digital jobs, but all jobs now are requiring those skills, not necessarily compensating people for those skills, but all jobs are requiring. And I was struck, I remember I was in the hospital for a procedure, and I noticed that the janitor who was coming around room to room, he had an iPad that he had to use to log what he was doing, the supplies, all of that. So I just think that these are just foundational skills, and we need to start to talk about them as being foundational skills, just like, reading and writing, numeracy, literacy, so critically important. I think in terms of, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now. If you look at the shift to online, of course, online programs and online education can really expand access. When you talk about rural areas, if it's so hard to get to a college, if you could participate in something of high quality online, right, that really opens up opportunity and has potential to open up opportunity. But the need to really design those programs in intentional ways. And so what we've seen is efforts to really look at how to support instructors and staff, right? I think what we saw during the pandemic, there's this shift to online, and a lot of I know I look a lot at community colleges, a lot of the faculty didn't, they didn't have the support to be able to make this transition effectively. And looking at innovative strategies for engagement. So we know that engagement and community is so important in the classroom. So in helping students to develop their skills for the workforce, how do you come up with those innovative strategies for engagement? And of course, the technology access. The technology access is key because without that, you can't get the benefits. I would also say, I think one of the opportunities we've seen in terms of how to really support young people, especially with respect to employment and the labor market, is that actually this digital world makes it easier maybe to access employers, in programs, in schools. And so in some research, we've seen examples of people being now able to connect, because people are we're sort of pushed to do this, right? But to connect with people that aren't where they live. So we looked at a program, for example, for young people in Chicago, and it is helping young people prepare for computer-based jobs and the digital industry, and they were suddenly able to have mentors in Silicon Valley. And so that's a tremendous opportunity, in terms of exposing young people to different professionals, different occupations, and really being able to make those connections. So I think there's both the risks, certainly risks, but there are a lot of opportunities to really try to build young people's access to these jobs and opportunities.
Well, you made a really good point when you talked about it's across all industries, all professions. I think we sometimes seem to think that it's a really small niche, but that's just a really good point. I think it speaks to what our next speaker is going to talk about, is that not only do we have to have the skill, we do need the access. So Jean-Claude, I'm so glad that you gave me the opportunity to shorten this, Jean-Claude Brizard, to a JC, just in case I stumble again, but thank you so much for being here. Digital promise, just interesting. I know you're committed to closing that digital learning gap caused by how Americans in and out of school access and use technology actually to improve learning opportunities. We're really interested in how you're approaching that challenge within the digital promise work.
Dr. Sharp, thank you. It's really great to be here. Just a quick 30-second background on the organization. We were created as part of the Higher Ed Authorization back under George W. Bush, Section 802 of the Higher Education Act, as a national center on research and digital technologies, et cetera, but now we're shortened our name to Digital Promise. We're no longer part of the government, but we are now a global 501c3. Yes, I think a lot of what both Shane and Rebecca talked about, I'm going to lean on a bit as well. We talk about the digital learning gap, not just the digital gap, because we really want to talk about the why this is so critical and why it's so important. We have this construct that we talk about here at Digital Promise called powerful learning. Let me perhaps describe why we think this is so critical and important. When you think about the classroom designs of today, what should be particularly ubiquitous across our nation, we think about this idea of kids designing, coding, animating. We think about, kids tackling entrenched global issues, right? We think about leveraging 360 VR technology to bring empathy, stories, etc. Really bringing, for example, places to life for a lot of young people. We talk about designing and building for global citizenry, right? So really critical work. We talk about teachers getting access to powerful technology. This concept of computational thinking, I think Shane talked about this, right? So STEM now, frankly, is ubiquitous. You don't have to become an engineer to have to understand all of the STEM sort of infused work that shows up in everything from ELA to any career you want to pursue. So in all, frankly, we're preparing a lot of young people for the future of work, whether it be in data science or leveraging data science to do all kinds of wonderful things. Really is critical that we design the kinds of classrooms, schools, curriculum, pedagogical practices, etc., that really leans on this construct of powerful learning. One more layer to that, though, when you think about the exploding interest in social emotional learning, in student well-being, so the learning sciences really have become a big part of our discussion, including efforts on cognitive science, neuroscience, as teachers better understand how students learn. All of that leans on the kinds of classroom design, curricular design, pedagogical design we know is so critical for today. But in all, we know that students must acquire the competencies, mindsets, and knowledge that prepares them for the global marketplace. I think it was Secretary Bennett said this a long time ago, that we're preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist. So the question is, what kind of skill set do young people need to be able to leverage to access the future of work? So this whole concept around powerful learning, we think, is really important. Yes, it leans on the things like deeper learning and everything else that we talk about, for example, but powerful learning requires powerful technology. And one of the things that we've seen over the last 18 months, for example, is that we've done a lot in closing the digital gap. New America produced a report back in June, which I can put in the chat in a second, that really looked at the advances we made around closing the digital gap. The challenge, frankly, is that many of the things we've done in closing the digital gap is temporary or insufficient. So what they cited in the report was that although we are now near 86 or 90% of kids having a device or some access to broadband at school and or at home, two things become a problem. One is that not every kid has it at home. So we have not yet really closed the homework gap. Second, frankly, and we know how important that is, and the report shows that even families benefit from the kind of technological access that you see at home. But many of these families have a bit of an under access issue. So the data plan is insufficient, for example, or the technology is not powerful enough. In our discussions with Intel, we're looking at the use of AMDs versus sort of more advanced chips, for example. So if you want to leverage 360 VR technology, you got to have powerful technology. So it's become, frankly, an equity issue where so many folks are running to close the digital gap, but it's not, again, think about the refresh rates, don't think about the kind of support teachers and principals need to integrate technology in the classroom. So very often forget about the why this is so critical. So the three things that we are doing at Digital Promise to actually push on this issue. One is we have a massive program funded by Verizon called the Verizon Innovative Learning Schools. And we've demonstrated in about 500 or 600 schools across the US how to actually close the digital learning gap. As you can imagine, even with the ESSA money coming into schools, the big demand is really on professional learning. So yes, we want the devices. Yes, we want sufficient access to the web, but what we're seeing is a demand for coaches, a demand for show me how to integrate this work into the classroom, into the pedagogy. So this particular program also launches a bunch of coaches across nearly 34 states in the US supporting schools. And now we're beginning to publish these are the underpinnings of that to inform the work of agencies in the US government, to inform the work of superintendents, et cetera. The second thing quickly is that we have a team focused on learning experience design. So it's not just about, again, the tools, but how do you leverage the tool in designing the right kinds of classroom? We do a ton of work with the National Science Foundation around computational thinking. And again, to Shane and Rebecca's point, we talk about, frankly, how do you think about STEM careers? How does it show up in every facet of curriculum across the school? And last again, but not least, we have a large team of learning scientists who are looking at science curriculum, math curriculum, you name it, frankly, even in non-academic development of young people, in painting and providing the pathway to post-secondary in the workforce. And of course, our credentialing program also bridges that into the workforce. So we're looking at this from not a P12, but a P, the workforce continuum.
You know what I'm going to take away from this? I love your comments about, thinking about powerful learning. Because I think sometimes we don't think about it in that way, that we need the powerful technology to do that. But what I just think that's really, I love that phrase. Shane, I think you have something to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, which I found. I've been working with a set of community colleges, and many of them have programs that really have a strong technology focus. So they're digital design programs, other kinds of IT programs. And what struck me is, one thing that was amazing in the pandemic was that we managed to get like nearly every child a laptop, right? Kind of amazing. I mean, I haven't seen the data, but it was kind of amazing how this thing where we thought we could never do, we just kind of did, right? But Chromebooks are very limited when you're trying to prepare people for careers in IT, and computer-based careers, very limited. And so we see this challenge that the actual technology that's available right now to so many students doesn't actually match what they need in the future of work. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And that's not going to be true across the board, but many times a Chromebook is the perfect thing for someone, right? It works, but it's insufficient in many cases. And so I think that's just another dimension of the gap.
So that's a nice segue into a question I think I'd like all of you to consider, that, as leaders, as we're trying to prepare the next generation for a changing economy, what challenges within the work you've done in trying to implement or advocate for new programs and policies, and what strategies have been effective to be able to move the needle? So Shane, do you want to add anything to what you just spoke of? Because I think this is kind of a nice way in which you set the stage for this question.
Sure. Yeah. So definitely there's that challenge around technology. I would say there's a challenge. Just educational systems are rigid and hard to change, and so there is, as I mentioned before, just this real need to think about pedagogy in a different way, and to really provide support for institutions on those issues, but also just like changing the way that we think about education. And I know this is a K through 12 context. I work a lot in the post-secondary context, but I think some of the information is similar. Some of the constraints are similar. So, so for so long, we just think about education as like time in a seat, right? Instead of the development of competencies. And so I think that we've seen it's exciting time, because we are seeing this shift to like, let's like measure our success based on whether people learn what they need to learn. Let's ask people to apply for jobs and just determine whether they're qualified based on whether they have the competencies, not whether they have the specific degrees. And so I actually think that is an important shift that's happening now, but it's very hard, and it's very hard to change those systems. I do think this like moment in time, when you have like such a crisis and just like such tumultuous times, it does provide a window of opportunity in terms of policy and practice change. The other thing I would say in terms of challenges, I think, we talk about inequities and like barriers for students of color in particular in accessing some of these high wage jobs in the technology sector. And some of this is about making sure they have the right skills, but often I think we focus too much on like, how do we fix the learner? And we need to think more about like, what are the gaps on the business and employer side? So thinking about employer practices and hiring, we know there's discrimination in hiring. It is still there. Every study you see that does like a paired resume test where people have a certain sort of ethnic name and someone has a white sounding name, discrimination over and over and over, it's still there. And so like, how can we think about those barriers and work with employers on trying to open up access so that young people can get those opportunities. I think also the employers themselves, I mean, it's just through the whole, how they post the jobs, what is required in the jobs, just rethinking that part of the work, I think is so critical if we're going to open up these opportunities.
Shane, I just saw a lot of nodding of heads when you talked about a couple of things, particular, and we talked about seat time. I think we could have a whole panel on that about how archaic that is. Isn't it interesting that we still operate that way, but we don't expect that out in the workforce. So really interesting. Yeah, Rebecca, I know, could you kind of add on to the conversation?
Absolutely.
The same
Yeah,
sort
I
of,
think, first of all, learning as a hostage situation is not a great place to start for anybody. And I really loved, Shane, what you were saying about this concept of how do we fix the learner? And I think we've got some legacy pieces around, the way, let's say, standardized testing has been leveraged. And when I first started teaching, we were graduating kids that couldn't read. I totally understand why our state went the way they did with some of the standardized testing. But we've then turned that as the way that we're judging the success of educators and the school. And this goes back to the idea of who are we expecting to be sort of the change agent in a situation. The idea that an individual child's test scores are somehow responsible for an educator, a school, a system's measures of success, when the systems should be serving the needs of the child, and the child has no ability to even see the layers, much less change them. So that's actually a model we use quite a lot when we're working to sort of understand problems that we sort of encounter in education. Just that pattern of like, okay, who are we actually expecting? Who's holding the burden of this particular piece right here? And I think one of the things that really helps is to step back and start to think in terms of the systems in place, right? Again, an individual child, an individual classroom teacher, they have their work to do, but they can't change an entire system. And one of the things we talk about a lot internally is the hallmark of a well-designed system is it continues to behave the way it was designed to behave, even when the designers are no longer present. And when you think about the origins of public education in the United States, it was originally designed to filter students out of opportunities, right? And that was based on gender, that was based on race, that was based on socioeconomics, and all the other factors in between. And so when you start to look at it that way, one of the hallmarks, again, of a system that's well designed is it continues to behave that way, even when the people in the system don't necessarily see that that was the original intention. As we can see, is more and more groups of students, we have increasing diversity, and wave after wave of student is still having the same outcome as previous generations. And so I think for us, we really approach these issues from kind of polar opposites and hope we bridge in the middle. One of the strategies that has worked really well for us, first of all, anybody can grumble about public education. I know the statement I just said was really positive about systems and who they filter in and out. But if you put a group of teachers in the room, and in my heart, that's where I still am, we're all going to start to grumble and, this, they keep adding one more thing and never taking anything away, all of that kind of stuff. So we really start in our work with schools and teachers and classrooms and really asking, what are the assets at play? What do you have that's working? What initiatives have you really seen have an impact? What initiatives actually invite all students in your building in? And which ones maybe is it only the certain kids that get to join? So some of those questions and starting off with what's working, and then how can we infuse this into those existing systems and structures that are successful in that work? And then I think for us at the larger scale is a combination of grassroots and policy. So we engage with a lot of teachers. We have thousands of teachers a year go through our programs. That's everything from one-day sessions all the way to year-round cohorts that prepare teachers to be computer science integration coaches, from kindergarten all the way through high school. We offer, I think, 24 different programs now across the board. So that's a capacity building thing. When a school or a division comes to us, district, Virginia, their divisions, nowhere else. When a school district comes to us, and a lot of times they ask, they want to know what devices, what this. It's like, that's important. But first you need to invest in your teachers, because your teachers should be the one driving what technology needs their students have, because they know what they need to do in their classroom, in their instruction. They need to have the knowledge, the skill base, and the community to support the implementation of the learning that they're receiving. And then the next step is that will drive, is it a Chromebook that works really well because students have high degree of internet access, or maybe we need to pick a different device because a lot of the kinds of things we want to access aren't available on a Chromebook because the internet's so limited, right? The teachers know that at, again, that grassroots level. So we do a lot of work there. A strong example of that actually is our faculty program. So we have a very strong core ethos around teachers. It's subtle. So all of our trainers are current classroom teachers that receive additional training in computer science, adult learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, a lot of other things along with that. Those 50 faculty are across the state. They're not just clustered here in the capital. They're all over the state, and they're very diverse demographically. So they represent the communities that they come from. Because again, the needs for us in the Tidewater area, where it's very heavily military, and you might have a completely different student population every 2 years, versus out in Appalachia, where you have students who are going to the school their grandparents went to, right? Those needs are also diverse. So recognizing that there's a culture in K-12, the needs are diverse, just like the needs for our students. So that's an example for us of like where we try to build that grassroots support. That grassroots support then becomes our feedback loop of those are the folks we go to first. So we actually flipped very quickly online when COVID first hit. We delivered 20,000 hours of professional learning in 6 weeks that summer. And part of that was because we had that team of faculty. We came up with a plan, sent it out to them. They took out every red marker they had, busted up, this isn't going to work, you need to do this, this, this. And we were able to really quickly crowdsource a plan that was really workable for all educators. That ability to crowdsource information against a really diverse group of people that represent the different populations across our state is what drives the policy work for us. So where we've had, I think, 6 bills now passed by our state legislature and managed to get some funding behind it, it's not just us saying, hey, this is something we need to do. By the way, here's this community of thousands of educators that, you know, when someone says, we frequently, well, elementary students can't do this, it's too hard. Why don't you talk to our facilitator here who's been running a school-wide computer science integration in a Title I urban school for 6 years now successfully. Let's go and talk to her and see what you can't do for kids. So I think that combination of really sort of proving that it's doable by doing it, and then using that crowdsource and energy to then drive those structural changes. Because again, that grassroots by themselves, they can't change the system, but the policies and the structures can be changed to start to implement those changes in the system that hopefully open up more equitable access for all students.
Well, I want to dig into the policy thing a little bit more after JC, if you allow me to call you that. After JC responds to the question, because I think it's really, you really struck a few things I think are really fascinating there, Rebecca. But JC, if you would dig in a little bit here.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what Shane and Rebecca said sort of really resonated and kept shaking my head. And in fact, we kept changing about how I would think about the question, because again, there's so many facets to this. Actually, I've copied down some of the things you said around the hallmark of a well-designed system. One of the things that we are pretty obsessed with here is systems change. Is how do we actually not think about the student, but the system in which this person is actually living, I think is really critical. There's a data set I've been using quite a bit to really look at the entire pathway of a student. And very few states have the data system where you can track a cohort of kids over time, but there's one in the Pacific Northwest that we work with. And if you look at 3rd grade or even early learning proficiency in reading or math, you take all the kids who are proficient, top and bottom of the scale, and follow them over the course of 12, 14, 16 years. There's a funneling effect. There's an attrition that takes place within the system and across the system. I can give you some numbers in this one particular state. If you take all the kids and you wait until they finish 2 or 4 years of college, the numbers around 25% of kids actually finish 2 or 4 years. If you lay on an equity lens on this and look at kids who are free and reduced price lunch eligible, it's like 11 or 12% of kids finishing. So if you're looking at kids who are going to be accessing the future of work, we all know some form of post-secondary experience is necessary to actually get to that particular level. If they're not finishing high school, and or if they're entering a post-secondary institution and they're wandering in, wandering around, they're wandering out, they're not going to get access to the kinds of careers that we're talking about. So the question of how you change that narrative, I think, is a big part of our question. All said, we do know that reading scores are not necessarily predictor of 4-year completion, because what we do, unfortunately, is capture learning in a one-dimensional, myopic way that doesn't really track and honor all learning. When I talk to people about this, what I keep pushing is that you can't tell a teacher, don't do chalk and talk, or all you give them is a blackboard and a box of chalk, right? So the tools have to change. So what I'm getting at very simply is I've become obsessed with this idea of the learning record, of the student learning record. Can we redesign that so it honors all learning, Again, not just what is happening in the four walls of a school, but what could be happening at home, what could be happening at an internship, what could be happening part of a summer experience. So to the ideas around competency-based education, for example, hard to implement because the vessel that we use to capture student learning is, again, does not allow for an easy translation to what has been frankly a myopic way of looking at student record. So when you think about creating something like a LinkedIn with verified credentials, you can put in their CBEs, you can put in their micro credentials, you can begin to honor all learning in a way that really is meaningful, where a student can design a portfolio to demonstrate to a higher ed institution or to an employer what they actually know. It can be used for upskilling of people over time as well too. You think about how the medical record is shifting slowly to where the patient hopefully owns a lot of it. And we know there's work in progress there, but it follows you. Could a very similar thing be done for students, but then giving them agency, frankly, of that? And by the way, this is not pie in the sky. This is beginning to happen in pockets across the country, thanks to the U.S. Chamber, the folks in Dallas, et cetera. But what is difficult in creating the kind of change we're looking for, two things. One is that many of the folks who fund this kind of effort, who provides the funding, are obsessed with national scale. And I want to really have come to believe that workforce is regional. If you create a regional proof of concept, with the policy and practice come along together, you can demonstrate to the nation what is possible. So that for me is a fundamental way in which we have to think about this. The second thing I think about is no single organization can actually change the narrative. So can we create value networks where different nonprofits, funders, government, for-profit are coming together, hopefully in a regional construct that really is beginning to move the ball in a way that is long-term thinking, not just around math or English proficiency. And let me just say that I have three little boys. I got 4 children, but 3 are in grade school. And folks ask me, what is their reading proficiency scores? As an educator, as a former superintendent, I was like, I have no idea. And frankly, I don't really care. I know I expect them to learn to read. I expect them to learn to do math really well. But for me, the outlook is a long-term view of creating for them a pathway that will put them on the path toward economic security, agency, right, and well-being. If that happens, then it's a wonderful life that they're going to have. What needs to happen is a means to an end, but in so many of our places, that means is the North Star. And we know we struggle with those sort of minimum benchmarks around what we do in schools, but we have to think longer term, and we have to bring a lot of folks together. So how do we solve this? And frankly, to Rebecca's point, how do we focus on the system, not just the student?
And Jean-Claude, I now want to live on your island. As a dyslexic and an Army brat that went to 9 schools, the idea of a learning record where, yeah, everything you just said, I think that, and the thing that's amazing is we're now at a point where the infrastructure to do those kinds of things is not that far out. I mean, if every purchase you make online is being tracked, why can't student success be tracked across all of these different nodes?
Yes, Rebecca, I'm talking to a group that's international now in nature. They've got like 60 or 70 school leaders from, I don't know, like 4 continents or 5 continents. They call themselves the Coalition to Honor All Learning. And they're pushing really hard to say, can we actually begin to change the construct and how we look at this? So we're trying to support them in this kind of effort as well.
I love that. That actually made me tear up a little bit. So
yes.
I always tell people I grew up on the dumb side of the island, and when my dad retired, we had a mistake and my school records got lost. Wow. And very consciously, because of how I look, the school system we moved into put me in advanced classes, and the advanced classes were great. They had brand new crayons and you got to do projects, and it was like, whoa, I had no idea this was happening. And literally that one mistake changed my life. It's how I ended up in college. So, I think about, like, I didn't do anything in that situation, and how many students that don't have the advantage of having basically their record lost, right? So.
What a great story, Rebecca. And I think,
yes,
when we think about educational, it's so much easier if we keep things, if we have things we can measure, and those are things that, that's what we do. I always said that, we're not working with widgets. We're working with these squishy little objects that come to us, and sometimes they're messy and they don't come, in the same package and whatever else. But unfortunately, those things that we try to keep, and it's easier for us to measure those external things. But wow, JC, when you talk about that whole person, you know, that's what it's truly all about. Okay, so we're going to switch here quickly. So we do have a question that I think is really interesting. That I'd like to from the audience that they'd like for you to discuss the policy changes that really left us so unprepared for the shift to digital learning and work during COVID-19. And you know, our teachers just did an amazing job. I think we can all acknowledge that. But boy, it was like you turned the water switch off one day, and the next day teachers are supposed to go and just do what they've always done in an online format. But boy, there were some policy challenges with that just left some of us unprepared. Does anybody want to address that and talk about that during that period of time?
Yeah, I can start, and please welcome my colleagues to join. You know, when you think about digital promise, you know, initially we were designed to help bring technology to the masses, to get educators and adults to use technology. Of course, we've shifted now to really how you actually use technology. You know, so I think a big part of it has been, frankly, lack of leadership from top tier leaders around the funding and support of one-to-one technology that really were left to the devices of the most progressive leaders, whether it be state or school districts. So many places didn't have this, and the places that had an orientation to one-to-one technology, it was a seamless pivot during the pandemic. So maybe it's both a policy and practice, one around funding that really wasn't there. I can tell you, for example, I was both a principal, teacher, and superintendent in New York State. We had this thing called the New York State textbook law, which provided funding for textbooks across the state. We could not change that money to buying technology. I mean, look, print, and that law, by the way, still exists in New York State. So there were all these things that were put in play that was like 20, 40, 50 years old that didn't allow and convince people that, yes, you had to go to one-to-one. And by the way, there are states in this country that will not buy from a McGraw-Hill or Mifflin digital curriculum. They only want print materials. So all these archaic laws still exist in the U.S. Frankly, that is not allowing for this kind of pivot. Last thing I'll say, again, goes back to the funding and the development of leadership, is that the training and development of folks who really, or the ability to actually commingle funds to do what needs to be done, frankly, has not existed. So many funding systems are categorical, and folks cannot shift and do what they know is important. So the system is not nimble at all in responding to all of this.
It's a great example. What about Shane, Rebecca? Any comments there?
I mean, money. I mean, this is not policy, but like, where do we want to put our money? It's about what priorities for funding. And so we were in this emergency situation. And so all of a sudden schools could get a lot of money for these kinds of things. And before they couldn't. And so and we know it's just like, we spend a lot of money as a nation, and we don't spend it at the national level, certainly on education, compared to all the other buckets of funding, right? And so that's a policy question, but it's also a values question, and one that's hard. It's hard to address, but it, again, like I said before, a crisis situation like really can make you rethink things, and I think that's what's happened here. So, which is why it's like a moment in time that we really want to seize. I think be able to keep the momentum around some of these issues.
And I think to ditto or hop onto the train with both of you there, it's that piece too of, again, what's the underlying structure? When, I'm here in Richmond City in Virginia, obviously, Henrico County, which is right outside, was the first county in the entire United States to have a one-to-one initiative. It was a big Apple program back in the day. And, still the city of Richmond, which literally Henrico County wraps around, really struggled with basically this sort of issue around devices and how do we make sure students even have the internet at home. Even in an urban center, that was a real struggle for folks. And so I do think maybe if folks, have kind of recognized there might be a little bit of inherent inequity in public education, it might be a good time to start to ask, how do we actually just structure this? If folks are familiar, there's a really good book, 5 Miles Away, A World Apart, that's actually written about schools right here. I could probably literally I'm in the middle of the 5 miles between those two schools, but it really does a good job of highlighting in a 5-mile radius, the lack of opportunity and the wealth of opportunity. And this is something I kind of challenge people when I do public speaking in general. Think about where you would send your students in your community, your own children. Within an hour, probably even 30 minutes of where you live, there's a school that you wouldn't imagine sending your students to. And just that empathy of thinking, it's like, well, those families aren't choosing to go to sort of that school. Start to think about what opportunities, why do you have the opportunity to make the choice to not engage in that school and other people don't? And I think really starting from that place of, if we really value equality, if we really want to be a place where all people have opportunity, we have to start at the very beginning and ask some really tough questions about, because the thing is, these were all choices. These are choices that were made at a certain moment in time. And just because humans made a choice that was the best model that they had at the time doesn't mean we have to stick with it. And so I think that's really what I would urge people to start to look at in their own communities, is where are there things that they may be participating in. And again, most people in a system don't understand the design of the system. So sometimes it takes popping your head up a little bit and challenging and asking those questions about, well, why is it school funding is tied to real estate prices? Let's just start there. There are other ways to fund things. Again, having grown up on Army bases, I can tell you that there are a lot of things on Army bases that are not tied to anybody's real estate, those kinds of pieces. So I think some of those underlying structural questions and trying to get people engaged in questioning the status quo. Just because we did it this way before doesn't mean the people who originally designed it were bad. And it doesn't mean we have to keep doing it the same way now. We can structure things in more creative and beneficial ways going forward.
Thanks all. And I think to that point, Rebecca, I think one of the things that makes it hard to change is that everybody's been to school. We haven't all been in the hospitals, we haven't all been in banking, but everybody thinks, it worked for me, or at least that's what they think it did. So it's like we continue to do the same thing again and over again when, it makes it harder. We have a couple more questions that if we have time, I'll let one of you jump in. How can schools or districts work with parents and families to build digital skills so they can better help their students at home? Anybody jump in on that one?
One of the things the New America Report highlights is that when you close the digital gap and you have one-to-one technology that goes home with the kid, you don't just change the life of a student, the entire family actually benefits. So we had one webinar with the US DOE focusing on this particular issue. One of the things we heard from some exemplar districts was that in their thinking around the digital learning gap, they also thought very deliberately about families and parents. One in California actually had drive-through tech support for parents. So they would go actually to these places where parents were working. Again, it's a smaller community. They have a lot of parents actually go to those places and set up centers where the student and the family can come together to think about this. We're watching, for example, in some places where Walmarts are turning some of their former McDonald's centers into places where kids can come in and work and get support with the family. In Washington State, we saw 2 housing projects, one in particular, King County Housing Authority, designed a full sort of virtual learning as a way of bringing students and families into the same space. And they hired these college kids, basically would come and support. So what I saw very simply is that it's a deliberate effort by school systems to engage families in a way that was really, really meaningful. My only push and hope is that it continues beyond the pandemic. But we saw a lot of that kind of innovation take place in parts of the country.
I think along those lines, it's a real opportunity for schools to do a gut check, making sure that you're communicating things and you have a common language with families in terms of how we discuss things and how we're engaging them. And I think just the basics of, like, when you're hosting a PTA meeting, looking around, do the parents in the room reflect the students in the school? If you're getting the same parents over and over again, maybe 6 o'clock at night is not the time to hold that meeting. Are there other ways to engage parents and invite them in? And I think recognizing that for a lot of families, schools can be a very intimidating place. So how can we get out into the community and try to listen more to really what the parents want for their students and what they need in order to help advocate and support this kind of learning in their home?
Shane, do you have anything to add? Or I do have a good question for you. I think that if,
Yeah,
unless
I
you
think we could move to that next question.
have, okay. So I think, Shane, I'll let you start with this one. Since the growth of online learning during the course of the pandemic, students have really had to navigate on their own, whether it's been time management, reflecting on their learning progress, et cetera. So how do you all think that college and university instructors can effectively use technology to help students develop self-directed learning skills as an online course?
Yeah, so I think, that just because a lot of it, there's an expectation around self-directed learning, that doesn't take away the need for that support and guidance. And so I think it is about providing that support and guidance, but in a virtual way. So it isn't really about independent learning, but it's about providing the supports to navigate that online learning. And so whether that's like through navigators or mentors or student support specialists, there's still a really important role for those folks. And then figuring out the best way to make that work in the virtual environment, whether it's using all of those technological tools like nudges and texting and whatever platforms the students are most responsive to, I think is really important. I think there are things that can be built into the technology, but it doesn't take away that need for support.
I was just quickly going to add, I completely agree. I'm just going to push that this is not just for higher ed students. I think all students need that kind of support. But one thing I've seen is the kind of scaffolding that takes place around, again, there's a specific skill around it, an executive function.
Yeah.
Is a skill we talk about in social emotional learning. The kind of specific scaffolding that takes place with the instructor to help someone become more independent is something I see in my first grader at home, and I see in my third year college student at home. So I live at a tight context, so I watch it, but good teachers know how to scaffold kids like that.
Rebecca, can you add anything to?
I cannot. I just cannot along because everything they said was amazing. I mean, at the core, really good instruction, whether it's in person, online, and everywhere in between, it comes down to relationships. And so the technology has to be there to support those relationships and the scaffolding of all of those different pieces. But you can't replace that relationship with a device.
I was going to give one last add to this. We have a digital promise, this thing called the Learner Variability Navigator. It really focuses on learning sciences. So teachers we get 10,000 hits a month from educators. So if you want to learn how to scaffold a kid toward executive function, you can go in the Navigator, pick the subject area, and there are very specific strategies can be had, again, all for free, funded by a few foundations, mostly the York Foundation, but again, it's there for folks to use. You can get very specific ideas on how to scaffold kids around executive function.
Well, what a great way to end. I want to thank each one of you, Jean-Claude, Shane, Rebecca, for your input and your insight into this issue today. So thanks again. And I'm going to turn over to Cheryl to close things out for us today.
Yeah, thank you, Melody and panelists, for a wonderful discussion. I know I learned a lot about digital skills gaps and what we can do to address it moving forward. And I think this is an important and ongoing conversation we're going to continue to have. So thank you all for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. We do hope those of you attending today will join us for another upcoming webinar that you see on the screen. The Hunt Institute has a lot coming out. The fourth webinar in this particular mini-series will occur on November 18th, and we will discuss lessons learned from the digital divide during the pandemic, so please join us for that. You will find a link to our webinars page in the chat feature, so please go and register for the topics and conversations that interest you. So once again, thank you for your time today and attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.